Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Bayan. I'm an assistant professor in civil engineering, and here also part of the CITRIS Intelligent Infrastructure Cluster over in Sutrata Jai Hall. Hello to our web viewers. If you're watching us from the web, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, and if you want to do so, IM us your questions. The URL is posted on our website, and we will be able to read the questions to the speaker at the end of the seminar. Also, I want to thank Infern for their support for this series, and do three announcements for upcoming events here at CITRIS. So on January 28th, we are going to have a symposium called the Beyond Copenhagen Symposium here over in the CITRIS building. On the 29th, there's a very exciting event, the I4 Energy, followed by lab dedication. So there's going to be a little ribbon cutting ceremony here in the building, and so you should all come if you're interested. And finally, March 19th is the deadline for the Big Ideas grant writing for students here on campus, and there's a $30,000 prize, so you're all encouraged to apply for this. So it's our pleasure today to have the fourth seminar speaker in the series of the Intelligent Infrastructure Systems series, which is also a combined lecture with our usual research exchange that a lot of you have been coming to. And I think in the context of what the Intelligent Infrastructure Systems cluster is interested in, we today have a very nice example of a system where data and physical processes appear together, and really IBM will provide us a very good example of the type of intelligent infrastructure that this cluster here has been looking for. It follows a series of talks that you've been attending that have been very exciting too. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Peter Williams from IBM. So Peter received his PhD in the University of Bath in England. He is currently the Chief Technology Officer for Big Green Innovations at IBM and also a Distinguished Engineer at IBM. So please join me in welcoming Peter for this talk.
Thank you very much. And as we're being filmed, I'll try and resist my normal urge to walk around because I guess I need to stay in front of the camera. I was asked to talk about water management and some of the implications for services science. It's a subject that's of considerable interest to me. By background, I'm a management consultant with about 20 years work doing strategy and change, kind of work with organizations in the public sector and the private sector, but always looking at the integration of new technologies with how they do business. Before that, I was my PhD is in politics, and I was a political lobbyist. So coming from a country like the UK, where water is a public good, to somewhere like California, where it absolutely isn't, from a political point of view, is extremely interesting. You get technology into the mix as well, so you get not only the politics of water, but the politics of technology and water. It's a different thing again. And a very fertile ground for services science, I would suggest, to become involved. So, just by way of background, Big Green Innovations, and there may be some of you have seen this slide a number of times, in which case I apologise now. Big Green Innovations is IBM's environmental incubator. We grow green businesses that we then hand over to some other piece of IBM to go take to market. So far we've done three. The first was a greenhouse gas reduction business, mainly a set of consulting services around a process improvement methodology called Green Sigma, and a bunch of software tools. That we got to a certain point. We've now handed that over to our consultancy, Global Business Services. They are now taking that to market. The second was pulling together a whole bunch of innovations that we had in process in our labs and in our semiconductor fabs in the area of photovoltaic energy, solar cells. We've pulled that together. We've struck a number of licensing deals with various people. You won't see a solar cell with an IBM logo on it anytime soon, but you will see solar cells with our technology inside and the technology that went into their manufacture. And the third, the blue area, is water management. The other parts of the portfolio, alternative energy, covers the solar cell work that I mentioned, and also an awful lot of work that IBM has been doing for many years in the area of smart grid, by which I include things like smart meter infrastructures, improving the transmission and distribution of energy through the grid, integration of alternative energy sources with a conventional grid, and so on. Why do I mention that? An awful lot of the intellectual property that we have developed for smart grid is actually what we're now applying to water management. A lot of the, in some cases even down to the algorithms, but certainly a lot of the networking techniques, a lot of the security techniques, a lot of the analytics software, and so on. So I was kind of explaining this to one of the congressional representatives from New York State about 6 months ago, and I got about 2 sentences into it. He said, "Oh, so you're doing smart grid for water?" And I thought about that for a little while, and for a few seconds I was about to say no, and I thought, you know what, it's close enough, we'll go with it. And to a real extent we are. And the other piece that I haven't covered is computational modelling, which is shown as a support for all of the other 3 areas. We have the odd supercomputer lying around. We know how to use them in terms of building models, running other people's models, tuning those models, and so on. And those services are highly applicable to water management as much as they are alternative energy, as much as they are greenhouse gas reduction. Off to one side of this diagram, so to speak, and not shown, is the work that I know Alex is familiar with, that we do around intelligent transportation. That is run from a separate part of the company. It kind of grew up separately, but it's very much part of our green portfolio as well. So that's a little bit of the background. There's one theme underpinning it all. And this is the theme, you may have seen all the advertising that IBM's been doing around the smarter planet and smarter cities, and you get those slightly strange looking people who actually are real IBMers saying, "I'm an IBMer" at the end. The theme that underlies it is this notion that, well, 2 things really. Firstly, the mesh is getting smaller. There are more measurement points in the world, so the mesh in spatial terms and in temporal terms is getting smaller. There are more sensors, there are more meters, there are more measurements being taken. So the spatial distance between those measurements is decreasing. The temporal distance, the time between them, is decreasing. So what used to be monthly is now weekly. What used to be weekly is now daily. What used to be daily is now hourly. What used to be hourly is now continuous. This is happening in ever so many sectors. It's happening in banking. It's happening in healthcare. It's happening in water. It's happening in energy. It's happening in transportation, and so on and so on. It's happening in terms of how you manage cities holistically, for example, as well. So that mesh is getting smaller. And at the same time, the area where new technology capabilities are coming in are in terms of the analytics and the ability to optimize and visualize that information. So now, for the first time, it really is genuinely possible to optimize an entire end-to-end supply chain so that all of the suppliers and all of the businesses in that supply chain are basically coordinating their activity as if that was one single logical enterprise. That's been spoken about for many years. It is actually now possible to do it. The big issue with getting it done is the politics as between individual companies, and politics is a theme that I'll come back to. But the ability to optimize with a greater span of ambition, if you will, it's now possible, let's say, if you want to create relating this to water management, if you want to create a true flood management solution, it is certainly possible to create a set of models that allow you to link data about the structural health of the levee in any given place, data about the bathymetry of the stream by that levee, data about the weather, data about storm surges, data about the topography of the land behind the levee, data about the value of the human infrastructure behind that levee as well, so that you can build genuine flood risk models that actually incorporate everything from the weather through the failure of the levee, through the impact of that failure, through the cost of the damage that's likely to be caused. Oh, and by the way, evacuation routes and that kind of thing. It is now possible to make that set of linkages. Few people do it yet. Again, one of the main reasons for that is politics. Different parts of that end-to-end process that I just described tend to be in different federal agencies, different enterprises, and so on. But the technology now is there to allow it to happen. Hopefully, over time, looking at the far end of the slide, though, the impact of those 2 capabilities is better decisions, both environmentally and operationally. And I'll share some examples of that. And also this notion, which is, I think, very important for the whole kind of services science idea, this idea of information utilities, other uses that people put that information to. So information collected for one purpose that is then used for another purpose. The absolute classic is the work that's been done right here with Alex, using cell phone signals, cell phone locator signals, to actually infer the presence of traffic or not. So that is an example of an information utility business. The more you get into environmentally green-related activity, the more you get into that, and the more the examples for these kinds of information utilities becomes clearer and clearer. So that's the kind of the phenomenon that's going on, and that's kind of the, as it were, the mega trend that is underlying an awful lot of what IBM's been talking about Smarter Planet. We see no reason why water needn't benefit from that trend as well, and goodness knows it needs it. So when you turn specifically to water, you realize that you look at any given water problem, it is likely to be at least partially and many times wholly about the information that is available to understand that problem, make decisions about how to manage it. These two quotes seem to me to make the point rather well. The one on the side closest to me is from Wired magazine, which you mightn't necessarily think of as authoritative, but it makes the point very well. The water problem is largely an information problem. The one on the other side from the NSTC is saying that decisions we're making right now, and this was written before the stimulus, but it's doubly true as a result of stimulus spending, decisions that we are making right now will shape the future of water resources and water infrastructure in this country. How smart, in effect, are we going to make those decisions? How good are the models going to be? How good is the data going to be? How effectively are people going to be enabled to use that information to manage those water resources effectively? That's, in effect, what the NSTC is actually asking. And these are the kinds of problems that I'm guessing the NSTC had in mind, what I call the data pathologies. You either don't have the data, which is actually relatively unusual, but there are cases when the data just doesn't exist, or you have it, but it's in the wrong scale, either the wrong spatial scale or the wrong temporal scale for the decision that you're trying to make. Or, again, you might be okay there, but the data's fragmented. It's held over between multiple different stakeholders, multiple different agencies, multiple different systems within one agency, so that you've got issues about format, you've got issues about scale, you've got issues about standards, and maybe the same data's been recaptured many times over. So you've got different agencies with sensing for the same aspect of water quality. Their sensors are on exactly the same stretch of riverbank. They're sensing for the same thing. The data's going in two different directions. They hadn't thought to kind of coordinate their efforts and say, maybe, if we collaborate, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Or again, you might have fixed that problem, but you've got too much data to use. I've heard it said anecdotally, I've no way of knowing if it's true or not, but only about 10% of all of the data that was ever collected that's relevant to climate change has been used. The rest of it's just sitting around somewhere waiting for somebody to come up with some purpose for it. There's too much data to use. And I've lost count of the number of conversations I've had with water agencies where we've got all of our data, our SCADA records going back 20 years. I've no idea what we're going to do with it, but there they are over there, pointing to some discs or, worse yet, some paper printouts on the shelf. Very much part of the issue. Or, yet again, you're okay on those areas, but the models that you're using to analyse that data are incomplete or they're incompatible. Or, worse again, they've actually tried to put the models together and come up with what we call Franken models. They kind of look roughly right when they work together, but on closer inspection, they're kind of radically wrong. The semantics haven't been properly matched up, therefore the conclusions are probably garbage. That kind of thing is surprisingly common. Or you're okay on that count, and the visualization isn't there. So you've got senior managers standing around scratching their heads going, so what's this actually telling us? Because it hasn't been visualized effectively. The data hasn't been used to actually tell a story effectively. So again, very common set of issues. And the prediction is entirely mine. As they say, 98.3% of statistics are made up on the spot. So here's another one. Unless we fix those problems, whatever we're spending on the stimulus or anything else for that matter on water management, some reasonably large proportion of that, and I'm guessing between 30 and 50%, is probably going to be wasted. You won't understand the problem properly that you're trying to solve. You won't understand if your solution has solved that problem. You won't understand the knock-on implications of putting that solution in place. But you're not going to know which 30 to 50% until something goes wrong, like Lord Thompson's famous advertising budget. 50% of my advertising budget is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which 50%. You've got exactly the same phenomenon going on here. 50%, 30 to 50% for my guess of what is being spent on infrastructure is likely to be wasted unless people think about the information that is being used to plan it in the first place and to operate it once it's in situ. And I'd also observe that water management is kind of in the wrong tense. So an awful lot of it is reactive. It's about fixing what happened or what didn't happen and just making sure it didn't happen next time. You get a really far-sighted agency. It's kind of, there's some real-time stuff. They're actually reacting to what happens as it happens, probably not holistically, but it is kind of starting to happen. The Holy Grail is actually predictive, which is actually collecting real-time data about the antecedent of the problem that you're trying to solve, or collecting real-time data about the antecedent of the phenomenon that you want to encourage, so that you're actually heading off problems before they happen, hence the Terminator analogy, or you're trying to enhance a particular event that you want to happen, but you're trying to do that by fixing the antecedents. A really good example of that would be analysing the nutrient content of water to head off the risk of algal blooms or eutrophication. You're analysing the antecedents of the problem that you're trying to solve in real time and fixing the antecedents before the problem actually arises. Predictive management. And that is where I believe water, just like with the electricity grid, just like with transport, just like with healthcare, that's where it has to get to. And believe me, it's some years away from that right now. So let's turn to California. It's very complicated. I drew this out originally. I just sat down one afternoon because I'd heard, been to a whole bunch of presentations, and I was just trying to think through in my own head, okay, so what exactly is going on? What exactly are the issues? And really, you've got a confluence of three issues. You've got a whole bunch of issues around water demand, the sort of light yellow section. So a whole bunch of things around climate change, changing the level of the snowpack, and so on. You've got a whole bunch of things around sea level rise and groundwater contamination. You've got a whole bunch of things around flood surge risk, which is affecting the reliability of the delta, risk of levee failure, and so on and so on. You've got the likelihood of drought. So a whole bunch of things around water availability. You've also got infrastructure losses. I believe in California, they say about 20% of all the water that's ever put in a pipe is lost, which is not good when you're in a drought. So you've got water availability. On the demand side, you've got a whole bunch of things going on that are actually driving demand, whether it's just temperature rise from global warming, whether it's energy needs from global warming, because large amounts of water are needed to generate energy, whether it's population growth and urbanisation, or, and again, this is where the social, the services science piece of it starts to come in, whether it's things like lack of pricing, water's not appropriately priced for the most part, whether it's things like agricultural practices, whether it's social attitudes. The city of Fresno, for the sake of argument, well, not for the sake of argument, in fact, has an ordinance that actually bans water meters. The city of Redwood City has an ordinance that actually bans water recycling, even for putting on public gardens and yards and such like that. So, social attitudes to it. You've got the whole issue about the operation of water rights and the interplay between the legal situation around water rights and the availability of water. A lot of water rights in the state of California are use it or lose it, so they're like a budget. If you don't spend it in 1 year, you don't get it the next year. If you don't use the water in a given period, you don't get it for the next period. So guess what? The farmers throw it around with considerable abandon. You drive down I-5, in August, let's say, you're driving to LA, and it can be 115 degrees in the Central Valley, and I guarantee, around about 1 in the afternoon, you'll pass a whole bunch of farms that are using broadcast irrigation. 30% of that will evaporate before it even hits the plant. Sometimes they're actually trying to use it to drive down the selenium crust in the soil to a level below the roots so it doesn't kill the plant. That's the legacy of previous over-irrigation, so the remedy for previous over-irrigation is new over-irrigation. What's wrong with that picture? So you've got a whole bunch of different situations going on there. So you've got the water demand, you've got the water availability, and then you've got the actual ability to manage it. You've got the missing and the fragmented data that I was speaking about. Underpinning that and driving it, something there. At one and the same time, you've got the fragmentation of water resource management. So I've never been able to get an accurate count of the number of agencies in California that have some jurisdiction over water management, but the most authoritative I can find is about 2,800 in one way or another. And that's either about water supply or about the status and different aspects of the status of particular water resources, or about flood control, or about irrigation control, or about water quality reporting, and so on and so on. There's about 2,800 agencies. The UK, which is a roughly comparably sized piece of land, roughly comparable population, actually a bigger population, roughly comparable in terms of the complexity of its society, we have 20. California's got 2,800. So, and by the way, nationwide, there are 53,000 separate water systems, and 49,000 of them serve fewer than 10,000 people. So it's fragmented on an epic scale. It's a big issue. And that obviously drives the political effectiveness. And then you got sort of added details like zoning and permitting issues. I'm absolutely not warranting that is a complete picture. There is bound to be stuff in there that I haven't included, and I know I've kind of elided several things, otherwise the thing would be even more complex than it currently is. But, you know, as a thumbnail sketch, if you were, of California's water. So what are some of the things we can start to do about it? What I'm now going to do is talk about some examples briefly, and then I'm going to bring out some of the social sciences implications. The first is this thing that we call a collaboration platform. It's a concept that where you've got a body of water, in this case Galway Bay in the west of Ireland, that has multiple agencies, multiple stakeholders. You can't actually fix the organisational politics, but if you can get all of the different stakeholders to be using the same set of information, the same version of the truth, you actually change the quality of the politics, you change the quality of the debate, because everybody knows what everybody else knows, and it makes it much easier to collaborate. So what we've done in Galway Bay is we put a bunch of sensors out in Galway Bay. This is in partnership with the Marine Institute of Ireland, which is, I believe, is an offshoot jointly of the Irish government and the University of Dublin. So several sensor buoys out in Galway Bay. They're monitoring for about 35 different aspects of water quality. They're also monitoring for things like wave height. And increasingly, the latest iteration of the thing, which will go live in a couple of weeks, I believe, is they're hanging microphones off the bottom and listening for passing cetaceans, whales, so they can understand, you know, the incidence of whales in that area. That data is streamed back real time to IBM's cloud implementation in Dublin. It is processed in real time. So when those microphone signals come in, that data will be analysed in real time using some special streaming data software that will allow you to say, that was a whale, you know, that was a sea lion, that was something else, so that you can understand exactly what kind of a creature it was that just passed within range of the microphone. Significant integration with other data feeds, so whether you're talking about land use data, whether you're talking about weather data, and so on. And this information is all equally available to the stakeholders. And by the stakeholders, I mean the Port of Galway, the town of Galway, the Coast Guard, the fish farming industry, the leisure industry, the public, the surfers, they're especially interested in the wave height, as you might imagine. Each of those stakeholders has their own, what we call a portlet on that data. So it's the same underlying set of data. It's federated across a whole bunch of different computer systems all over the place. It's not brought into one place. And each of the stakeholders then has their own private portal, as it were, into that data. But the core data is absolutely common as between all of them. Like I say, you don't take the politics out of managing Galway Bay, but you do actually change the nature of the political discourse that goes on. Another important factor, which of relevance here, is the platform has been specifically designed to encourage collaboration between scientists and academics on the one hand and operational water managers on the other. So again, they're actually the science and the operational day-to-day decisions are going on with the same data. That is not a situation that exists very often in the United States. So this is the initial sketches of a project that is due to start on the 1st of February with Sonoma County Water Agency, just a few miles north of here. This is their collaboration platform. Effectively, what we're doing there, we're starting very small. We're taking, in Sonoma, you have a two-tier organisational structure. So you've got a water wholesaler, which is Sonoma County Water Agency itself, and you've got a bunch of retail agencies, and these would be the cities of places like Cotati, Santa Rosa, Roanoke Park, Petaluma, North Marin, I can't remember the others offhand, Windsor is one. We're starting with 3 of those retail agencies, and all we're doing actually in a very basic way is integrating their respective SCADA systems to one portal, so they each have insight into the status of the other's transmission and distribution system. All these transmission and distribution systems are linked. They are in turn collectively linked to the Russian River. The Russian River is part of the conveyance system for the district. So other information that is going to be available to them is information about the status of the Russian River from the USGS's streamflow gauges and a number of other sensors that are in that river, for example, around nitrate content and nutrient content, I should say, in the water, so that the basis for the decisions that the County Water Agency is taking becomes much easier for everybody to understand. We are actually working for Sonoma and Roanoke Park, Sonoma and Santa Rosa simultaneously they trust us, they're actually suing each other about water allocations at the same time. So that's kind of an interesting interplay, as it were, between, we're just kind of keeping our heads down, and all these shells are sort of passing over the top to some degree. But it's certainly the idea is that by making information more transparent, those kind of legal actions become something of the past, because each agency is enabled to understand the basis on which the other agencies are taking their decisions. They might not agree with it, but they do at least understand it. You've immediately changed the nature of the debate by doing that. Eventually, this will grow into what we're showing as the reference architecture, embodying all of these different layers, from the sensors through the networking infrastructure, through the actual data items. What's the data content of this collaboration? What's the data handling layer? How are you actually handling that data? How are you going to clean it and parse it and so on? A specific set of models, a specific set of applications, by which I mean things like a GIS, asset management, a business dashboard, probably the IBM Cognos product, a visualization layer, and last but not least, the business rules layer. Who is actually going to do what with which information, when, and to whom, so that you're actually driving the way people behave with the information, which is actually what it's about at the end of the day. So on the one hand, you've got the Russian River, which is the map behind those bars. You've got this natural resource. You've got the district-wide transmission system. And you have, the natural resource. You have the infrastructure. We're linking that through to the way people actually behave in terms of the things that they do with it, the decisions they actually make. And that, at the end of the day, is what we're trying to achieve. One very important aspect of and this is very much part of the long-term goal, is to create this thing that we're calling a water accounting system. So if you take Sonoma, it has the Russian River, which is a natural water resource, obviously, although it is actually partly fed through a man-made interconnect from the Eel River in Northern California. There are several reservoirs. There are 4 major groundwater basins. So each of those are water resources. Each of those water resources can be thought of as an account, just like a bank account, having puts and takes. You have water flowing into each of those accounts. You have water flowing out of each of those accounts. You have water flowing between each of those accounts. So the notion of a water accounting system says, okay, let's build a model that tracks. It's a gigantic water balance model. It tracks all of the puts and all of the takes to every water resource in that area. And this will include water that's flowing out, in terms of takes, water that's flowing out to sea down the Russian River and is lost to the region, evapotranspiration, which is water that is lost to the region, water that's shipped out of the district in products, principally wine, but is thereby lost to the region, the whole notion of virtual water in products and so on, which you may have heard about. And it'll have a whole series of puts: rainfall, water flowing in from the Eel River interconnect, water recycling, which they're now starting to go for as well. And the notion of the water accounting system is to say, okay, so how do we track the interplay between each of those accounts through time? And at one and the same time, we hope we're going to be building a management tool that will integrate all of the different contractors and all of the different stakeholders, as I just described, and something that will provide data that will feed scientific research in the long term. So that's a concept. We're not there yet. The example shown is one that they're actually building in Victoria, in South Australia. It is not an IBM project, I need to stress that, but it's very much the concept that we're taking and we're hopeful of applying to Sonoma. Another one is land use tools, Water for Tomorrow. This is a thing we're doing with the Nature Conservancy. We're basically creating a set of extremely simple, interactive models that allow people to explore different land use scenarios. So what happens if I manage this stretch? How it happens to this river if I manage this stretch of forest according to sustainable forest principles, versus what happens if I manage the same stretch of land and basically chop the forest down and grow soybeans on it, or build a housing development on it, or whatever it might be. What are the impacts in terms of the health and the quality of the water in the river? We're doing it first on the Paraguay Paraná in Brazil. That's the Yangtze, which I believe is the next one up. And eventually, it's intended to bring it back to the Mississippi, although that's not for a couple of years yet. And then finally, smart levees is an area where we are pretty active. We've got a project going in the Netherlands where, and it sounds like a heck of a lot of fun to be involved with, actually. They basically build this levee and they break it. They put more water against this thing than it can stand until it breaks. And in the meantime, they have studied this thing with a whole bunch of different types of sensors. And so they are basically exploring which combination of sensors gives them the best advance warning that a levee is about to break. that becomes the reference pattern for every levee through the Netherlands. So as these levees are rebuilt over time, that combination of sensors is built in. IBM's role, we are 200 miles away, sadly, which is the boring end. We're integrating the data as it comes in and demonstrating the feasibility, if you will, of a national levee control room, which I would have thought was a concept that would probably have resonance in California, frankly. It's absolutely possible to build such a thing. I like the quote, though. And this is talking about something you might have thought was fairly static, like a pile of earth, which is fundamentally what a levee is. A more accurate and more continuous insight into the functional quality of water management infrastructures will become increasingly important. Occasional measurement and manual data processing procedures will no longer be sufficient. And that's the premise behind the entire exercise. Again, massive food for thought for an organisation like CITRIS, I would have thought. So then, and this is my last slide, the services science implications, if you will, of some of the stuff that I've been saying. So how do you manage water as a combined natural and human system? I mean, the classic for that of the examples I mentioned is the Russian River, given that it is a natural resource with its own three endangered species in it, and an extremely beautiful area. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. It's a beautiful place. But at the same time, it's also a man-made system. It has human demands upon it. So how do you manage water as a combined natural and human system? Bearing in mind that thing about instrumenting the planet that I started with, what's the breadth of the variables that you have to optimize together to enable that kind of outcome? How many of those, what are the models that you actually need to enable that to happen? So what modeling, what simulation, what optimization tools add real value in that context? How do you plug and play those models together? How's that data going to be used politically and operationally? A whole bunch of issues to be thinking about. Or you're talking about the impact of information on decision possibilities. As I was saying, what's the actual behaviour that you want to encourage? I mean, yeah, you want to encourage conservation, but suppose you're expending more energy to conserve the water than you're saving in terms of the water that you're not pumping. So you're conserving at the expense of increased energy consumption. Is that a good trade-off? I have no idea. A good thing to potentially explore. How well do existing service systems work in real time? So if you are streaming real-time data to a lot of flood control activities right now, they fall right over because they couldn't use the data. So how do you design service systems that can actually use data that's available in real time and in very large volumes? In other words, how do you process that data? What applications do you need? How do you apply the appropriate visualization techniques to it so that people can actually see that stuff and take decisions? What new decisions become possible? What new policy options? The intent with Sonoma, as indeed it is with Galway Bay, is that there's a whole new class of decisions out there that people simply couldn't take before because they didn't know enough. And the idea is that, with that information, it becomes possible to manage the thing in a much more kind of proactive way. How will it better connect the scientific and the operational communities? As I say, there is a huge disconnect. I go to a lot of, a number of meetings, and where you have scientific input and you have water managerial input, and it's really quite depressing. Oftentimes they talk right past each other. The scientific interest extends as far as proving a hypothesis. The managerial interest extends as far as something I can, take decisions with tomorrow. And there's this gap in the middle, and all too often there's a failure to connect. And that, again, is something that I would have thought that CITRIS could concern itself with closing. What's the impact of information on, let's say, water rights? So the legislation that has been approved, subject to being funded by the ballot initiative in California, is going to mandate the supply of information about groundwater reserves, which is something California's never had before. What's that going to do to negotiating behaviour and the behaviour around water rights? I have no idea, but it'd be an interesting thing to study. I think it's going to be a train wreck, actually, but it'd be an interesting train wreck. Business case. So, again, Galway Bay, Russian River, the Paraguay Paraná, they're providing a whole range of ecosystem services. How do you actually value those? A rapidly growing area, which will become more and more important. And how do you then, having valued the ecosystem service, how do you factor that into operational decisions? So, just to take an example, suppose I release too much water down the Dry Creek watercourse into the Russian River. I go and flush out all of the endangered species in that river, in particular if they're spawning and they're very small. I go and flush them out to sea. Well, I've gone and killed that species. I have put more water in the river and made more water available for people to drink, but I've gone and flushed all those fish out to sea. Well, that's gone and damaged the leisure and tourism industry. So net, am I putting more money into the area by doing that, or am I taking money out of the area? What's the value of the ecosystem service, in other words, versus the value of actually having the water in the first place? Again, the technology is there and the body of thought is increasingly there to allow people to actually make those kind of decisions in a way that was simply not possible to do in the past. So that becomes an important theme. How do you value the preservation of economic potential? So you're investing more in water resources as an investment in the continued economic expansion of the Santa Rosa area or the Petaluma area. How do you value that? Why isn't that factored into water management decisions like it should be? Because it isn't at the moment. There is no methodology for doing that kind of stuff. Or at least there is no agreed methodology would be a better way to put it. So, how do you do that? Or again, talking about the information utilities. So we're collecting all this water information about Galway Bay, or we're collecting all this information about the Paraguay Paraná, we're collecting all this information about the Russian River. Who else wants it? So in the case of the stuff at Sonoma, the wine industry absolutely wants it because they want to understand the levels of the river, because they want to understand how much water is available for things like frost control and heat, preventing damage to the vines from heat, because they spray them. They spray the vines. And they need to understand how much water is available in the river to actually do that. The water agency needs to understand whether they're likely to be spraying so it can release more water into the river to maintain the flow. But again, what's the business model that allows that to happen? Is it just a bureaucratic procedure, or is somebody actually taking a cut out the middle and doing it as a piece of private enterprise? So, a number of different business models, a number of different issues there. So those are some of the service science implications. Let me stop there and see if we have any questions.
So we voluntarily left about 10 minutes because we thought it would be a very provocative thought and would enable discussions. So we'll have mics for people who want to ask any questions to our speaker.
Hi. I'm interested in the future of water rights and water contracts. Clearly we have, these water rights that date back 50 or 100 years when the world was quite different. And somehow it seems insane to just cling to these very same contracts, when the world has changed so much. What's happening on that front?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and least of all am I a water lawyer. But I think the intent of just say the recent legislation, the set of water bills that have just been enacted. Clearly, by mapping groundwater, you're getting information about the amount of water that's underneath somebody's land. So you are taking a step in the favour of saying this stuff increasingly has to be managed as a communal resource. I'm studiously avoiding saying whether that's right or wrong, but it is starting to happen. I would think that there will be a continued move in that trend. Whether the entire basis of water rights is going to be rethought, that would be a huge proposition, and I would probably suspect not. But you are certainly going to start seeing inducements, encouragements to share information and to manage water, on a more kind of communal level, I would have thought.
I'm wondering, what are some of the measures of efficiency that you're going to use to actually make sure that something like in Sonoma Valley that you're doing, the Russian River, that it's actually making a positive impact?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are a number of measures actually for different dimensions, but it would be things like energy consumption. It would be things like the amount of water released into the transmission infrastructure relative to the number of people served. There would be a bunch of ecological indicators about the status of the Russian River, including the variability in its flow, variability in the nutrient loading of the river, and so on. There's also statistics around things like floods, and eventually, one hopes, statistics around things like leakage from pipe infrastructure and so on and so on. So the answer to your question is that there'll be a lot of different measures, and I've just given you a few examples. Right?
Hi, Peter. I guess in your business model and sort of economic valuation, one thing that comes to mind that I think probably is included in there but you didn't speak to specifically is sort of the opportunity cost or the real cost of doing nothing. Or, from a risk management standpoint, I work for a utility and we're trying to figure out, especially in this down economic time, how to convince our business partners and our customers, where we want to invest their ratepayer money. And one of the things is there's a lot of studies going on in Sacramento with the Bay Delta and the Levees system. What can we learn happened in New Orleans and Katrina? And some of the risk management scenarios are these really huge, in the hundreds of billions of dollars impact if those levees should fail and we lose water supply. But that's a really difficult thing to model when it's not a cost today. So I was just curious how you're going to work in metrics for the cost of doing nothing.
Well, I mean, there are ways to quantify risk. Insurance companies absolutely quantify that stuff. And it's the likelihood of the risk times the impact or the severity of if that risk actually happens, right? So there are, there are insurance models that are available to do that. Would be one avenue I would take. Again, I was asking the question. Sooner or later, that comes to be comes to undermine the economic development of a region. Well, there is no real methodology to value that, so far as I know, at this point in time. Let's just say it's an emerging field or an evolving field. So the answer to your question is, I don't fully know yet. All I am saying is that there are particular techniques out there that people could make use of. There are other techniques out there that are waiting to be developed and waiting to be invented. I'd also observe, though, that although it's often difficult to cost justify anything with water because, the intrinsic value of water is not right, Adam Smith and all that, the diamond water paradox and so on, 1776. And so it's an old problem. You can value things that are associated with water. So energy is principally one. So, take pipe leaks. A lot of water agencies say, well, it's not worth fixing leaking pipes, just let the darn things leak. Well, actually, you can value the energy that you're using to pump that water straight out through a hole. The other thing you can value is risk of property damage. So in the city, and by the way, that risk can be both financial and political. The city of LA caught a fair amount of flack recently when it lost a fire engine down a sinkhole. It was very embarrassing. The fire engine pointing out with its back end pointing out this enormous hole that had just gone and driven down because the ground had given way underneath it because a leaking water main had completely undermined the road. So you can value that kind of stuff. It still requires political will to take action, even in the face of that valuation, right? And nobody would dispute that. But again, you make the information available, you do start to change the nature of the politics. It becomes harder to ignore some of this stuff. It becomes easier to agree that something is a problem, even if you don't necessarily agree on the solution, but at least you're one step further forward. Yeah, so that was an evasive answer, right? I don't actually know, is the net.
Thank you. It seems like a lot of the data that you're generating and using is very quantitative, measured, sensor data, levels of water, all of that. But in many cases, what comes to mind is those 49,000 small systems of under 10,000 people across the country that might not have the resources for that, but there's a lot of potential human-generated data. Maybe you can't actually measure if you're violating the Safe Drinking Water Act, but an operator might know about failures in a system. How do you see incorporating human-generated data?
Great question. So I'll give you another example, right? So you go and put state-of-the-art OTDR sensing through a levee. Okay, this stuff can sense deformation. It can sense changes in temperature. And all of those things, and it can tell you where the deformation is happening, where the temperature change is happening, from which you can infer the likelihood that that levee is under stress in that particular area. At the same time, you've got the Caltrans guys or the DWR guys are driving these things in trucks every day. They drive along all of the levees. Well, why wouldn't you capture their observations? You talk to them, they know the weak points, because they've watched this. They've watched the levee over the last 10 years. Why wouldn't you capture that human observation and correlate it with what the sensors are telling you? You've just gone and got a triangulation. So it's a great point. And it becomes really, really important where you have consistent human coverage of the phenomena that you're trying to measure. By all means, use the human data as well and correlate that against the instruments. Sensors drift over time. They go wrong. Quite apart from the fact that you always want two sources of data for the same problem. Yeah, great point.
Where do you see the best thing coming out of the smart grid? What function do you see is going to have the biggest impact in the environment coming out of the smart grid for water?
I mean, putting it at its crudest, you will get more people served with water relative to the amount of water being put into it. So it's an input-output thing, just like it is with the smart grid for energy. You're meeting more demand with less energy. Likewise, you're meeting more demand with less water. And with greater assurance of the quality of that water and with less risk of property damage from leakage and such along the way. I mean, that's actually what it comes down to. But above all, you are integrating the environment. You are able to integrate the environmental perspective. I mean, the environmental perspective with water is absolutely different than the environmental perspective with energy, right? But you are integrating the environmental perspective as you are making those decisions, not as a separate, abstract scientific exercise, but at one and the same time as you are making operational decisions about turning on this pump, opening that valve, releasing water into this drainage ditch, those kinds of things.
So you mentioned earlier in the talk that there was a lot of data collected by all these different stakeholders, which has probably not been unused and maybe not even digitized. So how are you actually going to use all of that information that's already been collected, and how are you going to integrate different data sets across all these different stakeholders?
So I didn't want to say that it wasn't being used. Some of it is not being used. Some of it is being used for one purpose when it's also suitable for another purpose, right? Good example of that, the USGS stream gauges in Sonoma. Well, the USGS is using those and making extensive use of them. What we're doing is getting that data via a web service feed into the collaboration platform that we're building for Sonoma. But I'd also, I mean, in fairness, you'd really want to point out that the state itself is making huge efforts to try to address some of this. And a really good example is the California Water Quality Monitoring Council, where they've taken a really smart approach to it. What they said is, okay, let's take some really basic questions. So for any given water resource, is this water safe to drink? Can I swim in this water? Can I eat fish caught from this water? And they've integrated the data behind those questions. So they've really tried to think it through from the status of a member of the public. You know, the kind of question you might ask. This lake or whatever is, right behind your backyard, and you want to know if it's okay for your kids to swim in it. Or you're on vacation and you see a body of river and you think, oh, well, that was cool, but am I going to get mercury poisoning if I go in it? Well, they've integrated many sources of information specifically to answer those kinds of questions. And as a paradigm, I would have thought that takes some beating. I mean, it's really quite intelligently done. So the answer to your question is there's lots of different ways it's going to be used, really.
Another question about, you mentioned how highly fragmented the water infrastructure is, and especially a lot of the competing business and political interests. I wonder how you manage security across the systems as well as authenticate the data.
Yeah, that is a great issue, a great question. It's really, I suppose you'd say, the dirty secret of the sensor industry that most sensors are currently wide open to being spoofed. So that basically you have a sensor represent that a reading is within the normal range when in fact you've just gone and tipped anthrax in it or something like that. So people don't realise that what's happening. It's a significant area of risk, no question. How you actually secure those things is a whole other story. We're not aware yet, really, truly, that the software exists to enable that to happen. Maybe it can't even be done by software. Maybe it has to be done through algorithms that are actually written to some kind of processor inside the sensor. It's a great question, and it's a question that needs a lot more work. There are no sort of super ready answers to that. It's by the way, I mean, I know of a water agency now whose 2 main tanks serve this entire town. The only security device on those tanks is a padlock on the gate. Right? And these tanks are small enough that you could tip a really very small quantity of something unpleasant in there and do in that town if you wanted. The only security they have is a padlock on the gate. There is no cameras, no nothing. And the gate, by the way, is about 7 feet high. You could vault it. So it's a problem that the water industry as a whole would appear to have. When you put in sensors, you've got a particular dimension to it. And this is quite apart from the fact that people see a sensor floating in the river and go, well, that's nice, I'll take that home. Or something, It is a problem that exists. It's a problem that is beginning to attract attention, in my view, nowhere near the attention that it needs to have. Yeah.
Peter, you mentioned earlier that when you look at the framework of supply, availability, and infrastructure for water, that about 20% of water is lost once it's in the pipes.
Yeah.
Can you speak to some of the, if you Pareto out some of the reasons why that's the case, what are some of those top few reasons of where the water is going?
Well, it's going out through leaks. And by the way, it varies very, very widely. So, I mean, 2 European examples that I know of, right? Berlin loses about 5%. London, where I'm from, or from close to London originally, loses about 40%. The reasons for both of those towns had the heck bombed out of them in World War II, and all of their infrastructure needed to be replaced. Berlin made the investment to replace it. London just patched it. So it's a legacy of basically underinvestment in infrastructure. The city of Boston reportedly has very high leakage rates, and apparently some of its water mains are still made out of wood. They're hollowed out tree trunks, apparently. So, you know, similar. It's an issue that accompanies lack of investment in infrastructure, and in particular, lack of investment in the metering and the sensing technologies that can detect leaks much faster. I mean, that's what drives it.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful talk, and please join me in thanking our speaker again today.
Thank you.